The mountain was silent except for the wind through the pines. Eleanor Reyes sat on her porch, coffee cooling in her hands, watching the valley below through habit more than intent. 40 years old, 1 year retired, and still her eyes tracked movement the way they had in Fallujah, in Ramadi, in places that no longer appeared on any map she'd admit to reading. Through the scope resting against her cabin wall, a Schmidt and Bender she'd kept from her Marine days, she saw them. 8 SEALs. Surrounded. 3 minutes, maybe less, before the math turned against them. She set down her coffee. Some equations, she'd learned, don't solve themselves. The cabin sat at 7,000 feet, tucked into a ridge where the Sierra Nevada foothills began their climb toward higher peaks. Eleanor had built most of it herself over the past year. Weathered pine logs, a stone chimney that drew clean, windows positioned not for the view, but for the sightlines. 1 year she'd lived here. 1 year since she'd walked away from the Corps with a handshake, a pension, and a weight in her chest that never quite lifted. The locals in the town below knew her as the woman from the mountain. Polite but distant, capable but odd. They didn't know what she'd been. She preferred it that way. Once a month she drove her old pickup down the switchback road to Ridgeline, population 800, where she bought supplies at Hendricks General Store. The owner, Bill Hendricks, was 65 and had run the place since his father died. He was a good man in the way small-town men often were, helpful to a fault, but carrying assumptions he didn't know he had. Last month, when Eleanor had loaded 50 pounds of dog food, canned goods, and ammunition onto the counter, he'd smiled that smile people gave when they thought they were being kind. "Ma'am, you sure you can carry all that by yourself? I can have my nephew bring it up in his truck." Eleanor had looked at him, her face calm, and said only, "I'll manage." She'd carried it all in one trip, loading the truck bed with the efficiency of someone who'd humped 80-pound packs through desert heat. Bill had watched from the doorway, shaking his head. Strange woman, he'd probably thought. Eleanor didn't mind. Strange was safer than known. But this morning, standing on her porch with binoculars in hand, Eleanor wasn't thinking about supplies or small-town politeness. She was thinking about math. 8 SEALs in the valley below, running a training exercise near the federal land that bordered her property. She'd watched them before, always professional, always careful to stay within their boundaries. This time was different. She'd seen the movement an hour ago, the wrong kind of movement, coming from the eastern ridgeline. 40 men, maybe more, moving with coordination that didn't match recreational hikers or hunters. They'd flanked the SEAL team, encircled them in a depression near the dry riverbed, and now the SEALs were pinned. Eleanor set down the binoculars and walked inside. Her cabin was sparse. Military corners, minimal furniture, everything functional. In the back room, she opened a locked closet. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the rifle. An M40A5, the Marine Corps sniper rifle she'd been issued in her final years of service. Technically, she wasn't supposed to have it. Technically, it had been lost in a paperwork error during her out-processing. She'd never corrected that error. Next to it, in a hard case, was the scope. A Schmidt and Bender 3 12x50 PM2, the kind of glass that cost more than most people's cars. Engraved on the mounting ring in tiny letters, 3117 Reyes Go 9918. Her MOS, her name, her years as a scout sniper. She hadn't touched either in a year. The rifle stayed clean, oiled, ready, but unused. A promise to herself that she was done. That the mountains were her peace, not her battlefield. Eleanor assembled the rifle now with the kind of muscle memory that doesn't fade. Scope mounted. Bolt checked. Magazine loaded with .308 match-grade rounds she'd hand-loaded herself. She walked back to the porch, set the rifle on the railing, and looked through the scope. The world shrank to a circle of magnified clarity. She could see the SEAL team leader shouting into his radio. See the wounded man being dragged behind cover. See the hostiles closing in from 3 sides. She did the math. 3 minutes, maybe less. Eleanor had promised herself she was done. She'd walked away from the Corps because the weight of what she'd done, the people she'd killed from distances so far they never saw her coming, had become unbearable. But as she watched the math of the ambush unfold below, 8 operators against 40 hostiles with 3 minutes until collapse, Some promises, she realized, were meant to be broken. The desert had been different, hotter, flatter, deadlier in ways the mountains would never be. Eleanor was 38 years old, a gunnery sergeant, and one of only 12 female scout snipers in the Marine Corps. The year was 2016, and she was in Fallujah on an operation that didn't officially exist. The target was a man named Khalid Rashid, a former Iraqi intelligence officer turned insurgent coordinator. He was planning an attack on a coalition convoy that would kill 30 people, mostly civilians. Eleanor's mission was simple: stop him before he could give the order. She'd been in position for 16 hours. The rooftop where she lay was exposed, the temperature hovering at 115 degrees, even as the sun set. Her spotter, Corporal Danny Vega, lay next to her, scanning through his own optics. They didn't talk much. Talking wasted water, and water was survival. Below them, the compound where Rashid was hiding looked like every other building in Fallujah: crumbling concrete, narrow windows, a courtyard filled with dust and forgotten furniture. 40 men guarded it, rotating in shifts, all of them armed and trained. Getting close wasn't an option. The only way in was from 1,200 meters away, through a rifle scope. The mission brief had been clear: neutralize Rashid and his 4 senior lieutenants within a 15-second window. Any longer, and the remaining guards would scatter, taking their plans with them. Any shorter, and Eleanor wouldn't have time to confirm each kill. 15 seconds. 5 targets. Eleanor had done harder shots on the range, but the range didn't shoot back. The range didn't have wind that shifted every 30 seconds or heat mirage that made targets shimmer like ghosts. The range didn't make you think about the fact that the men you were about to kill had faces, families, lives that would end because you squeezed a trigger. Vega's voice crackled in her ear. Target 1 in position. Window, 2nd floor, northeast corner. Eleanor shifted her aim. Through the scope, she saw him. Khalid Rashid, 52 years old, gray beard, wearing a white dish dasha. He was talking to someone, gesturing with his hands, animated. She couldn't hear what he was saying, but she didn't need to. She knew what he was planning. 30 people would die if she didn't stop him. She exhaled slowly, her finger resting on the trigger. Target 2 entering frame, Vega said. Another man, younger, stepping into the same window. One of the lieutenants. Eleanor's breathing steadied. The world narrowed. Wind, 12 miles per hour, left to right. Distance, 1,200 meters. Elevation, 40 feet above target. She adjusted, calculated, waited. Targets 3, 4, 5 confirmed, Vega whispered. All in window, 15-second window starts. Now. Eleanor fired. The rifle kicked. She didn't wait to see the impact. Her hands moved automatically. Bolt back, eject, and chamber, bolt forward. Aim. Fire again, again, again. 5 shots in 12 seconds. Through the scope, she watched them fall. Rashid first, then the others, each one dropping before they understood what was happening. The guards below erupted into chaos, shouting, running, firing blindly at shadows. But Eleanor and Vega were already moving, descending from the rooftop, disappearing into the maze of Fallujah's streets before anyone could locate their position. The extraction was clean. The mission was a success. 30 lives saved. 4 weeks later, Eleanor received the Navy Cross in a ceremony attended by 6 people, all of whom had security clearances higher than most generals. The citation was classified. The operation was never acknowledged. And Eleanor, standing in that sterile room with a medal she'd never wear in public, felt nothing but the weight of 5 men who'd never know she was the last thing they saw. She requested discharge 18 months later. Her commanding officer tried to convince her to stay. "You're one of the best we've ever had, Gunny," he'd said. She'd looked at him and replied, "That's why I have to leave." Before she left, he'd given her the scope. "You don't get medals for what we do," he'd said quietly, handing her the case. "Keep this. Remember what it cost." Eleanor had taken it, nodded once, and walked away. She'd carried it to the mountains, where she'd tried to forget. But the scope didn't let you forget. Every time she looked through it, she saw Fallujah, saw Rashid, saw the math of death calculated in fractions of seconds. She blinked, and the desert dissolved into California heat. The memory faded, replaced by the present. Eleanor was back on her porch, the rifle in her hands. The scope trained on the valley below. The SEALs had 2 minutes left. The scope felt the same in her hands, heavier with memory but mechanically identical. Through the glass, she could see the SEAL team leader calculating ammunition, casualties, time. She'd done that math before. She knew how it ended, unless someone changed the equation. Eleanor moved quickly. She slung the rifle across her back and jogged up the ridge behind her cabin. There was a position she'd scouted months ago, a flat outcropping of granite that overlooked the valley with clear sight lines for over a mile. She'd told herself it was just reconnaissance, just knowing the terrain in case she ever needed it. She'd lied to herself. She'd always known she might need it. The climb took 4 minutes, her boots finding purchase on stone worn smooth by decades of weather. At the top, she dropped prone, the rifle settling into her shoulder with the familiarity of an old friend. She checked the wind, 8 miles per hour, right to left. Distance to the nearest hostel, 850 meters. Elevation, 400 feet. Through the scope, the battle came into focus. The SEALs were in a dried riverbed, using rocks and fallen trees for cover. They were good, disciplined fire, controlled movement, but they were outnumbered 5-1, and the hostiles had the high ground. Eleanor watched the SEAL team leader, a young officer with lieutenant's bars barely visible on his dusty uniform. He was shouting into his radio, calling for air support that wasn't coming fast enough. One of his men was down, bleeding from the shoulder. Another was nearly out of ammunition. The math was simple. They had 90 seconds before the hostiles closed the distance and overran their position. Eleanor dialed in her scope, adjusted for wind and distance, and began her work. The first target was a man with an RPG, preparing to fire from a rocky outcropping. She put the crosshairs on his center mass and exhaled him and squeezed. The rifle kicked. Through the scope, she saw him drop. She didn't wait. Bolt back, eject, chamber, bolt forward, next target. A machine gunner laying down suppressing fire. She fired. He fell. The hostiles were too focused on the SEALs to notice where the shots were coming from. Good. That's what she wanted. Below, the SEAL team leader stopped mid-sentence, his head snapping toward the ridge where the machine gunner had been. "Who the hell is shooting?" he shouted. His chief petty officer scanned the area, confusion clear on his face. "Not us, sir. Check your sectors. Someone's on overwatch." The lieutenant grabbed his radio. "Unknown friendly. Identify position." Silence. Eleanor didn't respond. She wasn't there to make friends. She was there to solve a problem. She fired again, and again. Each shot deliberate, calculated, spaced 12 seconds apart to allow for adjustment. The hostiles began to panic. They couldn't see her, couldn't locate her position. All they knew was that their numbers were dropping, and something they couldn't fight was hunting them. The SEAL team adapted quickly. They stopped trying to identify Eleanor and started coordinating around her. The lieutenant barked orders, and his team shifted their fire sectors, covering the center while leaving the flanks to the unknown shooter. It was an unspoken agreement, born from necessity and trust. Eleanor continued working, 9 hostiles down. The enemy advance had stopped. The ones still alive were retreating, scrambling back toward the eastern ridge, abandoning their wounded in their haste to escape the invisible threat. Within 6 minutes of Eleanor's first shot, the ambush had collapsed. The SEALs held their position for another 10 minutes, weapons trained on the tree line, waiting for a second wave that never came. Finally, the lieutenant lowered his rifle and turned to his chief. Where the hell was that shooter? The chief scanned the surrounding ridges with his binoculars. North. Elevated position, maybe 800 meters. Had to be military. Those weren't lucky shots. The lieutenant nodded slowly. "Get a team up there. I want to know who just saved our asses." They moved out, climbing toward the ridge where Eleanor had been. But by the time they arrived, she was gone. What they found was a single shell casing, placed deliberately on the flat granite outcropping. Next to it, a set of boot prints, small, too small to belong to most men. The firing position was perfect. Clear sight lines, stable platform, natural cover. Whoever had been there knew what they were doing. The chief crouched, examining the casing. 308, Winchester, match grade. This wasn't some random hunter. The lieutenant stared at the distant ridgeline, where the shots had come from. Whoever it was didn't want to be thanked. The chief nodded. Then we won't insult them by trying. They searched for 2 more hours, but the trail vanished. No vehicle tracks, no further evidence. Just one casing, one set of prints, and the ballistic reality that 9 hostiles had been neutralized with precision that spoke of decades, not luck. They searched for 2 hours, found one casing, one set of prints, and a firing position that calculated wind and elevation with a precision that spoke of decades, not luck. Whoever it was, Hale said quietly, staring at the distant ridgeline, didn't want to be thanked. Torres nodded. Then we won't insult them by trying. Eleanor watched them from a higher ridge, a mile away, through her binoculars. She saw them find the casing, saw them search, saw them finally give up and return to their team. Good. She didn't need their gratitude, didn't want their questions. She'd done what needed to be done, and now she could return to the life she'd built in the mountains, a life where the past stayed buried and the rifle stayed in the closet. She descended the ridge, returned to her cabin, and cleaned the rifle in silence. The scope went back in its case. The weapon went back in the closet. And Eleanor went back to being the strange woman from the mountain. 2 days later, she drove into Ridgeline for supplies. Bill Hendricks was behind the counter, as always, restocking shelves and listening to the radio. When Eleanor walked in, he looked up with the expression of someone who'd heard news worth sharing. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "You hear about the SEALs?" Eleanor set her shopping basket on the counter. "Hear what?" Bill leaned against the register. "It got ambushed up near your mountain. Some kind of domestic militia group, they're saying. SEALs were outnumbered, pinned down, figured they were done for." He shook his head. "Then someone started shooting from the ridge. Mystery sniper. Saved the whole team. Military's been up there investigating, but they can't figure out who it was." Eleanor loaded her items onto the counter. Coffee, canned goods, propane, and 2 boxes of .308 ammunition. Bill glanced at the ammunition, then at her, then back at the ammunition. He didn't say anything. Eleanor paid in cash, collected her bags, and headed for the door. "Ma'am," Bill called after her. She stopped, but didn't turn around. "Whoever that was up there," he said quietly. "I hope they know they did a good thing." Eleanor looked back at him, her face unreadable. "I'm sure they know," she said. Then she left. 3 weeks after the ambush, the SEAL team was back at their base in Coronado, attending a classified debriefing. Lieutenant Marcus Hale stood in front of a screen displaying ballistic analysis, trajectory calculations, and a map of the engagement area. The analyst, a civilian contractor with 2 decades of experience, pointed at the data. 9 confirmed kills. Range, 800 to 900 meters. Wind conditions, variable. Every shot was a center mass hit. Whoever did this had military training, extensive military training. The commanding officer, a captain with 3 combat deployments, leaned forward. "Do we have any leads on identity?" The analyst shook his head. "No, sir. We checked every military database, every registered marksman competition, every federal and state firearms license in the area. Nothing matches." Chief Torres spoke up from the back of the room. "Sir, with respect, maybe we should stop looking." The captain turned. "Explain." Torres stood, his voice measured. "Whoever helped us didn't identify themselves, didn't ask for recognition, didn't even stick around to make sure we knew they were friendly. They solved a problem and disappeared. If they wanted us to know who they were, they would have told us." Hale nodded in agreement. "Chief's right, sir. Maybe we owe them the courtesy of respecting that choice." The captain considered this, then closed the file on his desk. "All right, we'll classify the asset as friendly unknown, and leave it at that. But if anyone asks, we acknowledge what happened. Someone saved 8 SEALs that day. That's not something we forget." The file was archived. The investigation was closed. But before the team disbanded, Hale and Torres made one last trip to the ridge. They carried with them a small bronze plaque, no larger than a paperback book. On it was engraved a simple message: "To the unseen, semper fi." They bolted it to the granite outcropping where they'd found the shell casing, facing the valley where the ambush had occurred. It wasn't a monument. It wasn't official. It was just a quiet acknowledgement that somewhere out there, someone had their backs when it mattered most. They didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but they knew enough. 3 months later, Eleanor was hiking the ridge above her cabin when she found it. The plaque, weathered slightly by sun and rain, but still legible. She stood there for a long time, her hand resting on the cool metal, reading the words over and over. To the unseen, Semper Fi. She didn't cry, didn't smile, just nodded once, the way Marines do when something is understood without words. Then she turned and continued her hike, leaving the plaque where it belonged, a marker for a moment when the world almost broke, and someone decided it wouldn't. Time would pass. Eleanor would grow older, but for now, at 40 years old, she sat on her porch each morning with her coffee or watching the valley below, watching for threats that might never come, watching because some obligations outlive the uniform. The rifle stayed in the closet, cleaned and ready. The scope stayed in its case, waiting, and Eleanor stayed in the mountains, invisible to the world, visible to anyone who might need her. She never sought recognition, never told her story. The town below still saw her as the strange woman from the mountain. The Marines she'd saved never learned her name, and that, she decided, was exactly right. Some people serve in uniform, some serve in silence. Both matter. The most powerful service is the kind no one witnesses, the kind that expects nothing, the kind that simply exists when the math says it should be impossible. Eleanor Reyes had learned that lesson in Fallujah, carried it to the mountains, and proved it one more time when 8 SEALs ran out of options, and the world needed someone who didn't need to be asked. She'd promised herself she was done, but some promises, when broken for the right reasons, become something greater than the vow itself. They become legacy, not carved in stone or written in history books, but carried in the muscle memory of those who survived because someone, somewhere, was watching. If Eleanor's story moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who honors quiet service, and subscribe to She Carries Honor for more stories of the women who served in silence but carried the weight of nations. Their stories deserve to be remembered.